After completing the module, participants will be able to summarize main decisions to be taken in defining the tax base, outline approaches for setting the tax rate, and list options for determining the tax rate trajectory. In this module, we look into considerations informing decision-making on tax base and rates. Numerous countries have undergone the process of designing a carbon tax. Let's have a look at the tax design decisions some of these countries have made. Consider the two tables. They show actual tax rates and emission coverage of 4 jurisdictions, from highest to lowest. Do you know how the 4 countries rank in each of the 2 categories? Simply drag and drop them into the tables.
As we can see, in practice, a wide range of tax rates and emission coverage exists. Notably, countries with high national income do not automatically adopt high carbon tax rates or have broad greenhouse gases coverage, as in the cases of Japan and Switzerland, respectively. By contrast, some developing countries may have more extensive tax bases, such as South Africa. In the following sections, we discuss how and why countries come to decide differently on their respective carbon tax policies and what considerations guide their tax design.
The tax base of a carbon tax refers to the taxable products, activities and emissions. Defining the tax base is among the first and most crucial decisions to be made in designing a carbon tax. Determining the tax base requires making decisions on at least 4 issues. These are the scope of taxation, which gases, which economic sectors, and which activities the tax will cover, the point of taxation in the supply chain, the legal entity that will be liable for tax payment, possible thresholds of application. A first step in defining the scope of the carbon tax is deciding which emissions it will cover. The way in which the scope is defined depends on how the carbon tax is to be applied. Where the tax is applied to the purchase and sale of fuel, policymakers need to decide which fuels to include. Where the tax is applied to the act of producing emissions, such as burning or refining fuel, policymakers need to decide which activities and greenhouse gases will be subject to the tax. Click on each of the approaches for further discussion. Determining the right coverage is very context-specific and thus requires a good understanding of national circumstances. Coverage can reflect combinations of fuels and direct emissions. Here you will find some of the most important factors to consider for determining the scope of taxation. Can you match the description with the corresponding factor? Click on the factor you think the definition corresponds to.
The availability of appropriate capacities for monitoring emissions and collecting taxes in certain sectors or from certain fuels is necessary for the implementation of a carbon tax. Where these are not available, the level of new capacity needed for different design options is worth examining. Emissions reduction and revalue goals will influence the scope. Jurisdictions will want to align the carbon tax with their climate, energy, and economic policies to maximize complementarity while avoiding contradicting policy instruments. Mapping greenhouse gases emissions is central to determining where emissions take place and in helping to identify areas where there is potential for reductions. Some governments may be restricted in their ability to tax certain products or activities. This is most obviously the case in countries with federal similar system where the federal, state, and province governments each have a distinct set of taxing powers. And whether a sector or actor reacts to financial incentives provided by the tax is key to whether the tax will be effective in reducing emissions. This question can be examined using tools such as electric, um, elasticities of demand, marginal abatement, cost curves, and econometric models.
While approaches taken by jurisdictions will be context-specific, experience suggests there are 4 broad approaches to implementing a carbon tax: expansive, policy-specific, complementary, and top-up. Click on each to read more. The generation of emissions from a given sector or activity typically involves a range of actors operating at different points in the supply chain. In addition to determining which sectors or activities will be subject to the tax, jurisdictions must therefore also define which of the involved entities will be responsible for paying the tax. Though the number and characteristics of points in the supply chain will differ across sectors, they can broadly be categorized by 3 distinct points of taxation. Hover to read more.
Upstream taxes are applied at the point where the product associated with the emissions enters the economy. Midstream A midstream tax is applied somewhere between the point where the product enters the economy and the point of consumption. This is often at the point of processing or distribution. And downstream taxes are applied at the point of consumption.
Let's examine the case of fossil fuels. Here, several examples of actors in the fossil fuel supply chain are highlighted. In which of the 3 categories do they fall? Drag and drop.
Upstream we have coal mines, oil wells, importers. Midstream we have fuel distributors, electric utilities. Downstream we have households, industry, vehicles, and commercial buildings.
The gasoline supply chain example illustrates how the behavioural effect of a carbon tax is strongly influenced by where the tax is placed. There are 3 types of emissions associated with gasoline: emissions from combustion, emissions from processing at the refinery, and emissions from extraction or imports of crude oil. To tax the combustion of gasoline, the government can place the tax anywhere in the supply chain, from the point where the product leaves the refinery to the point of use. The incentive will work as long as the price signal can be passed up and down. However, fugitive emissions from extraction, such as methane, are not part of the carbon content of fuel, so they must be taxed separately at the source. The tax would be applied most effectively to extraction companies, that is, at the upstream point. Similarly, to tackle emissions from the refining process, policymakers should target refineries directly. A further important design decision concerns who is legally responsible for paying the carbon tax. The options available depend on the scope and point of regulation, and in particular, whether the tax is placed on fuels or direct emissions. Click on each of the approaches for further discussion. A threshold is a minimum level of activity that will trigger responsibility for paying the tax. Once an entity reaches a minimum level of emissions per year, taxation will apply. Thresholds help reduce costs of reporting and administration, while ensuring a sufficiently broad emissions coverage. This way, jurisdictions establish a balance between cost-effectiveness and environmental effectiveness. The use of thresholds is common in the case of taxes applied to direct emissions. It is also applied when the number of actors is relatively high, and their size and capabilities vary significantly. This graph of a hypothetical jurisdiction depicts the emissions associated with large, medium and small emitters, defined respectively as firms with more than 100,000, 50,000 to 100,000 and less than 50,000 annual tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions. Notice that by focusing the tax on large and medium-sized emitters, for instance by applying a threshold of 50,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year, a carbon tax might cover 95% of the emissions. This would limit the number of firms that must be monitored to approximately half of all emitters. The appropriate threshold will depend upon the distribution of sizes of emitters in a jurisdiction. However, a threshold can create an incentive to break up existing production facilities into smaller units to avoid compliance obligations. Similarly, a firm just below the threshold may choose to stay there, purposely curbing its growth. In practice, though, firms are unlikely to make major decisions like these solely based on the carbon price unless it is very high. With respect to actors responsible for relatively low emissions, the expected costs of reporting can be excessive relative to the actual taxes owed. The effective tax on the emitter can be understood to equal the tax levied plus the reporting costs. Importantly, if small firms have limited financial and human capacity to administer the carbon tax, or if the ability of the regulator to oversee smaller firms is limited, policymakers may want to set a higher threshold. Thus, smaller firms or regulators are protected from a disproportionate burden. Jurisdictions that apply their tax to fuels at the point of distribution have typically not applied thresholds. There are common reasons making thresholds less necessary in the context of fuels. Do you know the reasons?
The right options are fuel tax do not require direct measurement of emissions and are thus relatively easy to apply, and carbon taxes are often built upon existing excise taxes.
Ideally, a carbon tax would be applied to the sectors at the point where it is most environmentally effective. In practice, the decision will be influenced by the administrative burden involved in applying the price at different points in the supply chain. One important consideration in forming the tax-based design is the ability to accurately measure, report and verify emissions. Closely related are the costs and effort associated with administrating the tax more broadly. MRV and administration considerations differ depending on whether jurisdictions focus the carbon tax on targeting fossil fuels or direct emissions. So far, most jurisdictions that adopted a carbon tax have focused it on the use of fossil fuels. This has the distinct advantage of allowing the carbon tax to piggyback on existing customs and excise taxes. In these cases, MRV tends to be relatively simple and straightforward. Most jurisdictions will already have systems in place for monitoring quantities of fuel produced, imported and sold. Carbon emissions are thus easily calculated by applying an emission factor. A limited number of countries have targeted gas-emitting activities directly, most notably Chile, Singapore and South Africa. For certain activities, reliable proxies and emission factors exist. For instance, the measurement of emissions from electricity production by generators typically follows well-established procedures in most jurisdictions. In those sectors where reliable proxies and emissions factors do not exist, like agriculture and land use change, monitoring emissions can be especially challenging. The ability and level of efforts needed to monitor emissions meaningfully in a given sector can therefore be a key consideration in determining sectoral scope. Perhaps the most important element of carbon tax design is determining the tax rate. In practice, jurisdictions have adopted tax rates ranging from $1 to $25 per tonne of CO2 equivalent. When deciding on the tax rate, it is important to decide the goals. The rate can be designed to achieve different purposes through various approaches. This section reviews 4 basic approaches: the social cost of carbon, or SCC, the abatement target, the revenue target, and the benchmarking approach. The SCC approach involves reducing emissions with an eye on balancing the costs and benefits of emission abatement. In its broadest sense, the SCC refers to the global damages caused by emitting 1 additional tonne of CO2 equivalent. Reducing emissions avoids these costs and results in so-called marginal abatement benefits, or MAB. Based on this approach, a jurisdiction promoting economic efficiency would set the carbon tax equal to the SCC. Conceptually, policymakers set the carbon tax rate at the level where the marginal abatement cost, or MAC, equals exactly the marginal abatement benefit. At this point, the cost of an additional tonne of abatement equals the value of the abatement. If emitters abated more, that is beyond A star, the cost of abatement would exceed the cost of the tax payment. The shaded area represents the total gain in value to society. Although climate change impacts are often the primary consideration in setting the SCC, jurisdictions implementing carbon taxes may expect additional benefits from abatement. By adjusting the MAB curve and the implied SCC, these jurisdictions may achieve a fuller representation of benefits from reduced greenhouse gases. Health benefits, such as decreased incidence of diseases caused by air pollutants, better land and soil quality, enhanced energy security thanks to lower dependence on imported fuels, and improved transportation systems. In the diagram, the value to society would thus increase to the extent that the MAB curve incorporates these benefits. To date, several governments have calculated the SCC and used it as input for their overall policy-making processes. Estimates of SCCs vary considerably. For comparison, while the United States estimated the SCC at about $50 per tonne of CO2 for 2020, Germany regarded the SCC to be over $150 in the same year. SCCs are typically difficult to calculate, given the quantity of potentially relevant cost factors. The differences among the estimates stem in part from differences in the models used. The physical impacts considered, the valuation of damages at national and global level, and the discount rates applied. SCC estimates typically increase over time. This reflects the expectation that concentrations of greenhouse gases keep growing in the future, and hence the damages associated with climate change. In cases where the primary goal of the carbon tax is to meet a specific emission reduction target, governments can decide to set the tax rate at the level that is expected to achieve the required abatement. While with the SCC approach, the policy starts by setting the tax rate T star at the intersection of the MAC and MAB curves. Under the abatement target approach, the reduction target pursued is known, and the MAC can be used to set the tax T star without need for the MAB. Two considerations are relevant in this approach. Firstly, where there is uncertainty about the estimated MAC, there will also be uncertainty about the reduction level that will result from a specific tax rate. The MAC may be lower in contexts where governments adopted policies complementary to the carbon tax, such as programs for public information or technological development. Secondly, it is assumed that liable entities will respond to the price signal of the tax by adopting all abatement measures that have a lower cost than T star per tonnes of CO2 equivalent. If there is stickiness in the system, the level of abatement can fall short of the expected level. To reach the Paris Agreement's goal of keeping global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, ambitious abatement efforts are necessary. Today, about 3/4 of emissions covered by a carbon price are priced below $10 per tonne of CO2 equivalent. According to the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices, this price level is considered too low to incentivise emission reductions on the scale necessary to fulfil the Paris Agreement. In 2017, the High-Level Commission published a report with the objective of identifying indicative corridors of carbon prices to help meet globally agreed temperature targets. In the report, the authors conclude that the carbon price level consistent with those targets is at least $40 to $80 per tonne of CO2 equivalent by 2020 and $50 to $100 by 2030. Importantly, these figures imply that a supportive policy environment be in place. In cases where the jurisdiction is driven primarily by raising revenue through the carbon tax, the tax rate can be set so that it generates a specific level of revenue. Before the introduction of the tax, the supply and demand curves, S and D, intersect at a point corresponding to the market price, P, and quantity, Q. When the government introduces a tax on a commodity, the cost of production increases, moving the supply curve from S to S1. With the new, higher supply curve, S1, the new point of intersection is P2 and Q1. The tax revenue is, therefore, the product of the tax rate T and the new, lower quantity, Q1, that is T times Q1. It is important to remember that any tax functions within the constraints of supply and demand. In other words, it might be possible to increase revenues by increasing the tax. However, as the demanded quantity decreases with a higher tax rate, eventually total revenue starts to shrink. Either very high or very low taxes can lead to lower tax revenues than the intermediate tax level, which typically maximises the revenue. Make sense of the phrases by clicking the right option from each parenthesis.
Governments looking to both reduce emissions and raise revenue could encounter a tension between the two wants at the outset, adding a small tax will increase revenue and decrease emissions. However, as the tax rises, it will eventually reach a point where the carbon tax revenue hits a ceiling. Any additional increases in the carbon tax will enhance emissions abatement, diminish emission um, and decrease total revenue.
Benchmarking provides one of the simplest and lowest cost approaches to examining options for setting the carbon tax rate. It involves examining what other similarly situated jurisdictions have done in terms of the overall tax design they adopted, and particularly the tax rate they chose. Now, to identify jurisdictions appropriate for tax design benchmarking, a number of factors should be considered. Can you tell which ones?
Which factors should be considered during benchmarking? Similar finance sector, not really because the finance sector is typically not a primary concern as its activity does not involve major carbon emissions. With similar patterns of energy use is correct because makers could find it useful to examine the approaches of jurisdictions with similar emissions profiles and consumption patterns. With similar corporate saving rate is not really because experience suggests that the corporate savings rate is not a major factor to be considered for benchmarking. And similar politics, it is correct because political circumstances are a critical factor in setting the carbon tax and enabling certain design policymakers often set to benchmark against similarly situated jurisdictions and linkage with ETS pricing is is correct because where examples for similarly situated jurisdictions employing carbon taxes are limited. Carbon prices observed in ETS may provide additional context for benchmarking. And rising of trading partners and competitors this is correct because policy makers might consider the carbon tax rate set by economies with strong trading ties to their own.
Some jurisdictions will set a single carbon tax rate that remains the same for an indefinite period of time. In many cases, however, tax rates change according to a dynamic schedule or are otherwise adjusted over time. Changing the tax rate can serve a number of purposes, such as gradually allowing the economy to adjust over time, or to adapt to changing policy objectives and economic conditions. A common thread in these decisions is the tension between two important goals: predictability on the one hand and flexibility on the other. While investors and entrepreneurs need predictable conditions to develop businesses, policymakers typically seek to retain flexibility to react to new information, changing political goals and public priorities. While there are many approaches that can be used to address the question of whether and how carbon taxes should change over time, policymakers are advised to follow a three-step approach. First, set the intended trajectory. Second, determine the procedures for possible adjustments. And third, set the rules by which adjustments are made. For example, the intended tax rate at the time of adoption can be static or increase by a predefined value each year. Similarly, the tax legislation can include provisions for a periodic review of the tax rate, or leave it to policymakers or respective authorities to make changes ad hoc. Ideally, tax legislation informs not only when adjustments are likely to occur, but also according to which criteria or principle. Some criteria are more formulaic by nature than others, and thus require a lesser degree of political discretion. Many jurisdictions combine these approaches based on their priorities and circumstances. A fixed or static tax is one that simply stays the same after its implementation. This approach has the advantage of giving a stable and highly predictable price signal. This stability facilitates private investment. However, the advantages of stable prices depend upon governments' capacity to convince the liable entities that they will not adjust the rates in response to political pressure. The disadvantage of this approach is that it can give a substantial shock to the economy if the introduction of the tax results in a sudden price increase of fuels. This is especially the case when opportunities to adjust practices, such as production technologies, building design, etc., are not readily available. Also, the static approach does not allow for adjustments even in the face of new experience or changing policy objectives. Jurisdictions may choose to soften the impacts associated with suddenly putting a price on emissions by starting at a relatively low level and gradually increasing it to the long-term tax level intended. To achieve this gradual introduction, jurisdictions may set a specific trajectory for the carbon tax at the time of implementation. Gradual increases allow the economy to accommodate rather than experience a sudden major shock. Jurisdictions can also set a target rate for a given date in the future, while leaving flexibility as to the exact trajectory needed to reach that level. This is the approach taken by France, where in 2015 the government set the carbon tax rates for each year up to 2020, when it was due to reach €56 per tonne of CO2 equivalent. It also set the rate for 2030 at €100. Rates for the years 2021 to 2029 were to be determined in subsequent legislation. The French carbon tax represents one way of implementing the predictable flexibility concept. The tax design can also include provisions for a periodic review of the tax conducted by a panel of experts or government officials. Similar to an automatic formula, the government can review tax performance, revenue raised, and changes in emissions on a regular basis. Based on the conclusions drawn from the review, it can make changes if the tax over or undershoots its targets. While this guidance approach provides more flexibility and discretion than a strict formula, it potentially also allows for more political manipulation and ensuing uncertainty for liable entities. Jurisdictions can, of course, allow the political process to determine the adjustments to be made to the tax rate, with caution. While investors deal in risk by default, the risk associated with political processes is sometimes viewed with scepticism. Hence, liable entities facing a carbon tax might be reluctant to make investments in emission-reducing technologies and practices if they think the government will change the tax rate based on political rather than economic, technological, or environmental circumstances. The decision-making process should be transparent and designed to minimize the negative effects of political influence. Whether jurisdictions adopt a static tax rate or a dynamic trajectory, many important developments are difficult to foresee. Such developments may entail economic downturns, shifts in trade conditions, and technological advances. For this reason, jurisdictions may choose to build in rate adjustments that are automatically triggered by certain conditions. For instance, if abatement targets are not reached. The tax design can include an adjustment formula that incorporates factors such as progress in meeting emission reduction targets, revenue levels, inflation, exchange rate changes, and ETS price levels or the social cost of carbon. Resorting to an objective or impartial formula reduces the role of day-to-day politics and related uncertainty. On the other hand, automatic adjustments may prove overly insensitive when economic conditions call for more discretionary measures.
Key learning points. In comparison, taxing fields tends to be more complex from an administrative point of view than taxing emissions directly. The correct answer is false. When determining whether to levy a carbon tax, upstream, midstream, or downstream policy makers must consider which of the following factors. Select all correct answers. The correct answer is target actors' responsiveness to the price signal and administrative and MRV. And whether the task will be regressive, and it makes no difference where on the supply chain the task is left as the price signal is passed up and down is incorrect answers. The chosen tax rate coupled with the decisions around the base will largely determine which of the following select on correct answers. The correct answers is the abatement expected and the amount of revenue raised. The discount rate and whether offsets should be allowed are not correct answers. In order to allow liable entities and the economy as a whole to adjust to the adoption of a tax and invest in mitigation strategies, many jurisdictions have opted to start with a low rate and raise it gradually is correct answer. And set a static rate and use the social cost of carbon approach and establish an annual expert review is not correct. Generally, regarding the tax rate, policymakers strive to balance predictability on the one hand and flexibility on the other is true.